I feel like I've been seeing clippers everywhere. I'm getting Instagram ads for them. I'm seeing tons of people talk about clippers and using clipping in their mixing and production. However, I think it's still a topic that so many people don't quite know enough about because I've been using clippers a lot more this year in my production and my mixing, and I really feel like it has kind of taken everything to the next level. So in this video today, I want to talk about clipping. I want to talk about what hard clipping is, soft clipping is, how that compares to something like limiting or compression, and I want to show you exactly how a clipper works and how you can utilize that in your workflow to get really, really great results. So we're going to dive in and check all of that out. But before we do, my name is Austin. You're watching Make Pop Music. We have videos like this every single Friday. So if you like this, make sure that you like, comment, and subscribe. Also, in the spirit of the holidays, we're going to be running a 20% off of our entire store sale. This will be the last sale. So it's sample packs, preset packs, MIDI packs, even courses. Everything is 20% off between now, December 20th, and the end of December 27th. That's next Friday. I'll also remind you in the video next week. But we're not going to be pushing this one quite like the Black Friday sale. So if you want it, this is your big reminder to go shop that within the next week, save 20% off of anything you need. And if you want to be entered to win any Make Pop Music pack for free, all you have to do is leave a comment down below, and we'll be picking a winner on Monday, December 23rd. But let's dive in so we can talk about clipping and limiting and compression. I think we should start with what clipping actually is. So for this, I'm going to do something really, really rough. I'm about to show you why I am a music producer and not a visual or graphic artist. So here are two lines. Let's say that these represent a threshold. A threshold is basically, if you go over 0 when you're recording, you'll start to get that distortion, that clipping. If you go over a threshold with a compressor, that's when the compressor will actually start to kick in. So let's just say that this is our threshold. It doesn't even matter what that threshold is. This red right here, let's say this is our audio. So you can see that we're peaking over the threshold, and then we're starting to go down, yada, 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 and now we're in the threshold. Anything above this, all this stuff that I'm highlighting red, that's going to be that clipping, that artifacting, that distortion. That's typically what you don't want, right? Typically with audio, you want everything to fall within your threshold, especially for output. Much less so with like a compressor threshold or anything. But let's say that this is where you're starting to get clipping. This is where it's peaking your levels too high. Maybe you're hitting your limiter too hard. How do we actually get that in this realm without ruining the audio? That's our original. So you could always do compression. Compression is where you kind of start to control things like the attack and the sustain and the release, and you can have your gain reduction right here. Let me show you what compression actually sounds like. The issue is that compression is not fixed to keeping things within a threshold. So you could still be peaking. So let's say right here, let's hear the snare sample by itself. So we're peaking at -1.8. Let's turn on this compressor. We have kind of a slower attack, faster release. We're going to be doing a couple dB of gain reduction at a 4:1 ratio. So you can see we're getting about 3 dB of gain reduction. And we're still kind of peaking around that -1.7, -1.8. But what it's doing is it's actually changing the relationship between that initial transient and then the rest of the sustained sound. So that's going to give you something that feels completely different. So for this, it might be able to keep you within that ratio, but what's going to happen is it's going to actually feel like a whole different sound. A really good example is let's change the actual parameter. So let's go to something that is a fast attack and a slower release. So you can hear that we're still peaking right around the same. We're actually just a hair less, but it's so much snappier. You're getting that transient. And I think that this is where clipping really comes into play. I think a lot of people talk about transients. Transients are what makes music feel alive. It's what hits listeners' ears. But if a transient is too sharp, our ears don't really have time to react to it, especially with things like kick drums and low end. I think that people will rely on seeing that really, really sharp transient and seeing something like, maybe something like this. They're like, oh, that transient's great. However, if it's so fast that we're not really getting a chance to respond to it, it's not doing its job. So you could always try to compress it and try to control that transient, but since it's not really fixed to keeping things within a threshold, you might still be peaking over that. You could also use something like limiting, which is technically just a compressor that's set to an infinity ratio. This is a little bit better for keeping things within that ceiling so you don't start peaking. You can see we're still getting some gain reduction. And it's not going to be peaking too much. So you can start to hear how we're getting a louder sound. Here's without it. Here's with some limiting. But the thing is, now to get that transient to fit within that threshold, you're actually squeezing it. So it's still going to be changing the relationship between that transient and the rest of the sound, which is going to change how it feels in listeners' ears. The last thing that you can do is clipping, which for things like kick drums, snare drums, doing a little bit of clipping on your mix bus, this to me has become my preference. So let me show you how clipping works. With clipping, we're actually going to be chopping the audio off. Here's a great little infographic that I saw. Here's the original signal right here. You can see that it's in that threshold. We try to squeeze that down with limiting, but you can see we still have a big attack. It's just kind of controlling that release and that sustain. With clipping, it's actually just chopping the top completely off. So it's just taking a razor and boom, cutting that off right there. So if we had audio that is, let's say, peaking above it, the way that a clipper works is essentially boom. So it's not going to really mess up that sustain or that release or the way that the rest of the sound hits the listener's ear. It's just going to control that peak. So let me show you a great example. Again, here is the snare drum with nothing on it. Let's get a little bit of clipping happening though. I'm going to open up standard clip. This is like $20 or something like that. And we're going to clip this a couple dB. We're going to push some gain in about 3 dB. So this is going to allow us to chop the top of that audio off, but still maintain that negative 1.6. Hear that versus this. There's with no clipping. There's with clipping. And what's interesting is it is hitting this meter the same exact amount. So as you can see, by using something like clipping, you can kind of boost that audio without boosting that transient, which means that if you have a snare drum that feels really small and pokey in a mix, or if you have a kick drum that's not quite hitting a speaker, you can use something like clipping to start to shave that top off, raise the volume of basically the sustain and the decay and the release of it, and you can get something that feels more audible in a listener's ear. You could also use any other clipper. I love the Gold Clip Track. I'm doing the same parameters pretty much. To me, it's a little bit cleaner versus no clipping. Clipping versus no clipping. The only thing that you have to be really careful with clipping is that if you start to clip it too hard, you will start to get that distortion that people will also call clipping when you're kind of like tracking in and recording over zero. The distortion could be cool. It could be something that you're not really looking for though. Like, let's crush this. You hear that really nasty distortion? That's not typically what you want. Let's go back down to negative 1.6. And then the last thing in clipping is you can control hard clipping or soft clipping. I have a little graphic for that as well. Soft clipping is going to control that audio, but it's not going to cut it off like a razor blade. This is more so going to trim it like a little tool. Soft clipping could be good if you want to really control that sound, but you don't necessarily want to chop it off and introduce some of those harmonic distortion. So let's try a soft clipper. And let's make sure that we're not going to peak too crazy. Still negative 1.6, but if we introduce a hard clipper, you're going to hear it gives it a crunchier, smackier sound. Especially if we go like, let's go down here so it's pretty aggressive. Hard clip, soft clip. Hard clip, soft clip. So when you're going in and you're using clipping, make sure you pay attention. Do you want a hard clipper? Do you want a soft clipper? Do you want something that's going to really cut the sound off? Let me show you what all of these sound like back to back. Let's make sure we don't have anything on this. So we're going to go from the normal snare drum to a compressor with a slow attack and a fast release, a compressor with a fast attack and a slow release, a limiter that kind of matched that slow attack and fast release, and then a clipper. And I'm going to pull this meter up so you can see that we're not going to peak over negative 1.6, but listen to how different this audio will feel just by controlling things like the transient and allowing the rest of the volume to bloom. Now, all of those are peaking the exact same. So when you hear this versus this, in your ear, it feels louder because your ear is having a longer time to adjust to that transient. So by using something like clipping, now that I've kind of explained what it is and how it works, let me show you how this can actually sound in a mix, right? So let's go to a mix that's pretty transient. We have a big hip hop kick right here in the drums. Let's make sure that we don't have it on. Let's listen to just the drum. So if I have the kick without a clipper, let's see what this is looking like. We're peaking at negative 0.1. Which is not giving us a ton of headroom. Let's turn on something like a clipper, give us like a dB and a half of headroom, and I'm going to use hard clipping. I like that on kick drums, and let's see what this is doing for just bringing in a little bit of extra headroom. Versus It doesn't really feel any different to my ear, but I'm gaining a lot more headroom, which can help things like when you start pushing your master compression, your master limiting, you start pushing these things that rely on transient information too hard, it can start to squeeze your audio without you really wanting it to. So now that I've shown you how it works on like an individual track, we're clipping that kick drum, we're getting about 1.5 dB of headroom back. Let's show you what it actually looks like on a mix bus, right? I'm going to show you with everything. So without gold clip, we're literally at the very, very top of my range. There's a lot of dynamic range in this, but I think we can control that a little bit. So I can use something like gold clip, which to me is my preferred clipper on like a mix bus. For individual tracks, I love the knock clipper by Decap. I love the gold clip track, and then I also just love standard clip. On a mix bus, this is my go-to. So you'll see right here, I'm going to be clipping a few dBs off of it. And gold clip's great because it has these extra knobs like gold and alchemy. I'm not going to talk about these too much because this is not an ad for gold clip. I will say this plugin is pretty expensive. I do find that it is completely worth it because to me, it's everything that I want in a clipper for my mix bus. So let's hear this without gold clip and with it. And I'm going to kind of show you what this is looking like in terms of the audio. So without gold clip. With it. It doesn't really feel quiet here, but I'm getting 3 extra dB of headroom essentially. So when I do things like start to go into this compressor, I'm not going to hit this compressor nearly as hard on those transients, which means that I can just push everything. And then same thing with some saturation. Let's hear what this is all sounding like. Let's listen without gold clip. So with me engaging it, Mixhead has a little bit of soft clipping already into it, so we're not necessarily seeing a huge level on here. However, we're driving Mixhead much less, which is allowing us to get a more even distortion, a more even saturation, which sounds a lot more pleasing rather than this, peaking -12 on the transients and then, just sitting down here for everything else. Controlling those transients is a really good way to get your mix bus to feel a lot more open. So now, with all of that, before any limiting, let's see what we're looking at. Let's turn on our instance of Pro L. This is where I'm going to do my big limiting. Let me show you what this is sounding like. We can get a pretty loud master with only getting a couple dB of gain reduction on some peaks here because of things like clipping. If you wanted to control that even more, you could throw on gold clip as your last instance instead of your first instance. And let's just say that you want to shave off like a dB or something here. Check this out. I have gold clip, just basically pulling this down a hair. I took a couple substances, but now I'm fighting it. And it's 3 AM, and I can barely sleep. Haven't eaten anything now in a couple weeks. I essentially gain a dB of that headroom by controlling those peaks, but I do want to say you have to be careful with clipping because you could easily overdo this. Like, I probably wouldn't actually have this instance. I might not even be using that first instance of gold clip as hard if I wasn't demonstrating it. But to me, you don't want to shave off all of those peaks because that's where you can start to run into like flattening your audio and then none of those transients actually start coming through. So make sure that when you're using clipping, you're not just clipping it for the sake of clipping it. I know that's really tempting at first to be like, oh, I'm gaining tons of headroom. But, let's say that we clip this way down here and we'll keep the ceiling the same. We can raise this to kind of compensate for that. See, now that sounds really overblown because we're doing way too much of that clipping. Where if we want to just settle this out, even if we were to do this. And then let's say we go to our mix bus, you have to be really careful that you don't do this kind of stuff. And let's say we chop it down here.
It's 2 a.m. and I'm high again. Wishing desperately that I could go and phone a friend, but I'm all alone in my bed now, I'm lying there.
Technically, we're not hitting that limiter any harder, but since we're hitting all of those clippers way too hard, now it's getting that distorted, overblown sound that I don't think really sounds great. So now we go back in, we make everything a little bit more subtle, and then I'll show you what it would sound like without any clipping at all versus with it. Let's pull this back to, what do we have, this negative 1.6, and let's just do like 2.5 dB. So here's what our mix would sound like if we didn't have any clipping on the drums, no clipping on the bass, nothing like that. Here's what we're looking at.
It's 2 a.m. and I'm high again. Wishing desperately that I could go and phone a friend, but I'm all alone in my bed now, I'm lying there.
Let's turn on a little bit of clipping on that bass. Let's turn on a little bit of clipping with the kick drum. You could also do this on your snare drums. You could do this on basically any track. Let's hear this now.
It's 2 a.m. and I'm high again. Wishing desperately that I could go and phone a friend, but I'm all alone in my bed now, I'm lying there. I took a couple substances, but now I'm fighting it.
The whole mix feels louder, it feels more glued, and that's because we're controlling those transients. Transients are great, they're dynamic, but when you're trying to get a loud in-your-face master and you're not trying to hit something like a limiter or a compressor too hard, you have to control those transients. And for me, one of the easiest ways to do that is by clipping. You don't run into the same issues that you do with a compressor or a limiter, where if your attack and your release aren't perfect, you might be causing more harm than good. If your ratio's not quite right, you're causing more harm than good. I think a clipper, if you just need to keep that audio feeling and sounding the same and just cut off a little bit of that top to give yourself some headroom, that is the key. So I think try out a clipper, try out standard clip, try out gold clip if you have the money, try out gold clip track if you do download gold clip. The knock clipper is also really, really great. The clipper inside of the whole knock plugin is great. And then some DAWs have a good clipper. Cubase actually has a soft clipper, but I don't really prefer it at all. I think that a clipper is a great way to just spend a little bit of money, see if you can kind of open up your mix a little bit better, glue everything together. I'm a huge fan of having, nice, punchy, dynamic tracks. This track does not need to be overly dynamic. It ends up just sounding quiet. It ends up sounding a little bit anemic. The low end isn't really glued to the mid-range. And using something like a clipper allows me to push things like our compressors, our saturation, some EQ a little bit harder without it starting to get nasty, get distorted, get really, crunchy. So try clipping. Again, you can kind of see the audio right here. It's not the same as limiting. It responds totally different. Try everything in your mix. I just think that not enough people are trying clipping, and I think that some people might be trying to do too much with clipping. So go check some of those out. Again, if you want to be entered to win our giveaway, you can win a single make pop music pack, whether that's samples, presets, a MIDI pack. Just leave a comment down below before December 23rd. I'm going to pick one person at random. Other than that, I hope you have an amazing holiday. If you celebrate Christmas, Merry Christmas. If you're not, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Kwanzaa, Happy Holidays. We'll be back next week with more content, but I'll see you guys soon. Much love. Peace.